city pulsed with energy as the sun dipped below the skyline, casting a golden glow over the steel and glass towers. Among the countless people navigating the streets, Jonathan Harper walked with a sense of purpose, his mind racing faster than his footsteps. The crisp autumn air did little to cool the fire burning inside him. Tonight was going to change everything. Jonathan had spent years climbing the corporate ladder at Callaway Enterprises, a prestigious but enigmatic financial firm known for its wealth and secrecy. His ambition had propelled him to the top, but something had always felt off. Whispers of unethical deals, hidden transactions, and backroom negotiations had reached his ears more times than he could count. And now an opportunity had presented itself, one that would force him to make the most difficult decision of his life. As he reached his apartment, Jonathan hesitated before unlocking the door. A man like Richard Callaway didn't amass his fortune through clean business alone. If the rumors were true, stepping out of line would have consequences. But Jonathan had seen enough to know that staying silent would make him complicit. Inside, his phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number flashed on the screen. "Think carefully about your next move. You're not the first." Jonathan's stomach tightened. Someone knew he was digging. He deleted the message and sat at his desk, staring at the stack of documents in front of him. Financial records, leaked emails, and encrypted messages. Evidence that Callaway Enterprises was laundering money for powerful individuals who operated above the law. If he exposed this, it wouldn't just be a scandal, it would be a war. His best friend and confidant, Daniel, had warned him about this. "You don't go up against men like Callaway and walk away unscathed," he had said. But Jonathan couldn't let fear dictate his actions. He had worked too hard to get here, and he wouldn't let corruption win. The next morning, Jonathan arrived at work earlier than usual. The office buzzed with the usual chatter, but he felt the weight of every glance, every whisper. Were they watching him? Did they already suspect? His assistant, Emily, approached his desk with a concerned expression. "Mr. Callaway wants to see you in his office." Jonathan's heart pounded, but he kept his expression neutral. "Did he say what it was about?" Emily shook her head. "Only that it was urgent." Jonathan nodded and straightened his tie. This was it. If Callaway knew, then the game had already begun. The CEO's office was on the top floor, an extravagant space with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city. Richard Callaway stood by the window, hands clasped behind his back. "Jonathan," he said without turning. "Come in." Jonathan stepped inside, the door clicking shut behind him. "You wanted to see me, sir?" Callaway turned, his piercing gaze locking onto Jonathan's. "I hear you've been asking questions. Questions that could make life complicated." Jonathan kept his face unreadable. "I like to be informed," Callaway smirked. "A good trait in our business. But there's a fine line between curiosity and recklessness." Jonathan met his gaze. "And which side do you think I'm on?" Callaway walked around his desk, picking up a folder. "That depends on what you do next. You're a talented man, Jonathan. I've watched you grow in this company. There's a future for you here, if you know how to play your cards right." Jonathan felt the weight of the moment. Callaway wasn't just offering him a promotion, he was offering him a choice. Fall in line and reap the rewards, or keep digging and face the consequences. "I appreciate the opportunity," Jonathan said carefully, "but I need to think about my next steps." Callaway nodded, though his smile didn't reach his eyes. "Do that, but don't take too long." Jonathan left the office, feeling the noose tightening around his neck. He had to act fast. If Callaway suspected him, then he was already in danger. That night, Jonathan met Daniel at a secluded bar. He slid a flash drive across the table. "This is everything. If something happens to me, get it to the press." Daniel looked at him with concern. "Are you sure about this?" Jonathan exhaled. "I don't have a choice." The battle had begun, and Jonathan knew there was no turning back. The weight of his decision settled heavily on his shoulders as he walked home. The streetlights cast long shadows, distorting his silhouette against the pavement. His phone buzzed again, and he hesitated before looking at the screen. Another unknown number. "We know what you're doing. Walk away." His fingers hovered over the screen before he deleted the message. The threats were coming faster now. He was running out of time. Jonathan's mind raced. He needed to prepare for the worst. He started sending copies of the files to multiple encrypted storage locations, ensuring that no matter what happened to him, the truth would come out. As he sat at his desk, reviewing the final details, a knock at his door made his heart hammer. He grabbed a letter opener, his only makeshift weapon, and cautiously approached. "Who is it?" he called out. Silence. Jonathan's grip tightened. He stepped closer and peered through the peephole. The hallway was empty. A cold chill ran down his spine. Sliding the deadbolt into place, he stepped back, forcing himself to breathe. He wasn't being paranoid. He was being hunted. Jonathan knew that by morning his world could be turned upside down, but there was no turning back. He had a job to finish. The next morning, he left his apartment early, taking a different route to work. He checked over his shoulder at every corner, every crosswalk. The feeling of being watched had only grown stronger overnight. At the office, he was met with hushed conversations and lingering stares. Had Calloway planted spies among his colleagues? Or were they just curious about what was happening at the top? He walked to his desk, forcing himself to stay calm. Then Emily appeared again, looking even more nervous than before. "Mr. Calloway wants to see you now." Jonathan inhaled sharply. This was it, the moment of truth. He stood up, straightened his tie, and walked toward the CEO's office with steady steps. Whatever happened next, he was ready, or so he thought. Jonathan Harper took a deep breath as he walked toward Calloway's office, his mind racing through every possible scenario. His grip tightened around the files in his hand, a collection of damning evidence he had meticulously gathered over the past few weeks. He knew stepping into this room meant stepping onto a battlefield, but he had no choice now. The receptionist outside Calloway's office gave him a cautious look before pressing the intercom. "Mr. Calloway, Jonathan Harper is here." A few seconds of silence, then the deep voice of Richard Calloway came through. "Send him in." Jonathan walked inside and found Calloway standing near the expanse of glass windows, his hands behind his back. The city skyline loomed behind him, a stark contrast to the suffocating tension in the room. "Jonathan," Calloway said without turning around. "You been busy?" Jonathan forced himself to remain composed. "I always stay busy, sir." Calloway turned, his sharp blue eyes locking onto Jonathan's. "Let's not waste time with pleasantries." "I know you've been asking questions." Jonathan kept his expression neutral. "I like to be informed." A slow smirk spread across Calloway's face. "And what exactly have you learned?" Jonathan hesitated for a split second before responding. "Enough to know that not everything in this company is as clean as it seems." Calloway exhaled, stepping forward. "Let me give you some advice, Jonathan. Curiosity is a dangerous thing in this business." Jonathan's heart pounded, but he held his ground. "So is silence." Calloway studied him for a moment, then chuckled. "You remind me of myself when I was younger. Ambitious, determined, unwilling to back down." He leaned against his desk. "But let me ask you something, Jonathan. Do you think taking me down will make you a hero?" Jonathan's jaw tightened. This isn't about being a hero. It's about doing what's right. Calloway laughed softly, shaking his head. "That's the problem with people like you. You think there's a clear line between right and wrong. The real world doesn't work that way." Jonathan placed the files on Calloway's desk. "I have proof, sir. If you don't come clean, I will take this to the authorities." Calloway's expression darkened. He reached down, flipped through the documents, and then looked back up at Jonathan. "You're making a mistake." Jonathan swallowed, but didn't back down. "I don't think so." A tense silence stretched between them before Calloway finally smiled again. "All right, Jonathan, I'll give you credit. You have guts, but guts won't protect you." Jonathan straightened. "I can protect myself." Calloway's eyes gleamed with amusement. "We'll see." Jonathan turned and walked out of the office, his heart hammering in his chest. He knew this wasn't over. If anything, it was just the beginning. That evening, Jonathan met with Daniel at a quiet diner outside the city. The atmosphere was far removed from the corporate world, a place where no one cared who you were or what power you held. It was the perfect place to talk. Daniel sipped his coffee, his expression unreadable. "How did it go?" Jonathan sighed. "Calloway knows. He didn't deny anything, but he made it clear he's not going down without a fight." Daniel set his cup down. "That's not surprising. A man like him doesn't reach that level of power without knowing how to protect himself." Jonathan ran a hand through his hair. "I have the files, but I need more. If I take this to the authorities now, he'll bury it before they even get a chance to investigate." Daniel nodded. "Then we need leverage." Jonathan frowned. "Leverage?" Daniel leaned in. "Something he can't escape from. A witness? An insider? Someone who knows every detail of his operation?" Jonathan exhaled. "That's easier said than done," Daniel smirked. "Then it's time to start looking." The search for leverage led Jonathan and Daniel deep into Calloway's past. They dug through old records, contacted former employees, and followed every whisper of corruption. It was exhausting, dangerous work, but they were relentless. Days later, they found their lead, Marcus Langston. A former executive at Callaway Enterprises, Langston had abruptly left the company a year ago under mysterious circumstances. No one knew why, but rumors swirled that he had been forced out after discovering something dangerous. Jonathan and Daniel tracked him to a small town outside the city. They arrived at a rundown motel where Langston was reportedly staying under a different name. Jonathan knocked on the door. A few moments later, it cracked open, revealing a tired-looking man in his 40s. His eyes widened when he saw them. "Who are you?" Langston asked warily. Jonathan held up his hands. "We're not here to cause trouble. We just need to talk." Langston hesitated before opening the door fully. "You're with Callaway, aren't you?" Jonathan shook his head. "No. But we're trying to take him down." Langston studied them for a long moment before stepping aside. "Come in." As they entered the dimly lit room, Jonathan knew they were on the verge of something big. If Langston had the answers they needed, Callaway's empire was about to crumble. Langston sat on the edge of the bed, rubbing his temples. "You have no idea what you're getting into." Jonathan pulled up a chair. "Then tell us." Langston sighed. "Callaway isn't just laundering money. He's protecting some very dangerous people, politicians, criminals, even people in law enforcement. That's why I left. I couldn't be a part of it anymore." Daniel leaned forward. "Do you have proof?" Langston hesitated, then reached into a bag beside the bed. He pulled out a flash drive and handed it to Jonathan. "This has everything, transactions, accounts, names. If you expose this, you're not just taking down Callaway. You're taking down everyone connected to him." Jonathan stared at the drive in his hand. This was it, the leverage they needed, but with it came immense risk. Langston's voice was grim. "If you go through with this, you'll need to be ready. They won't let you walk away." Jonathan looked up, determination in his eyes. "Neither will we." Jonathan Harper clutched the flash drive Marcus Langston had handed him, feeling the weight of it in his palm. This tiny device contained the key to exposing Callaway's empire, but it also placed an even bigger target on his back. The dim light in the motel room flickered as Langston rubbed his temples. Exhaustion etched into his face. "You don't know the half of it," Langston muttered. "Callaway isn't just running a fraud operation. He's covering for people who will do anything to stay hidden." Jonathan exchanged a glance with Daniel, who sat tensely beside him. "We need names. We need to know exactly who we're up against." Langston sighed. "It's all in there," he said, nodding toward the drive. "Transactions, offshore accounts, high-ranking officials on his payroll. If you expose this, you won't just be dealing with Callaway. You'll be dealing with everyone he protects." Daniel leaned forward. "Why haven't you gone public with this?" Langston let out a bitter laugh. "You think I haven't tried? Every journalist I reached out to mysteriously lost interest. One of them vanished completely. Callaway's reach is further than you think." Jonathan's grip on the drive tightened. This was bigger than he'd imagined. "Then we do this carefully. We find the right people, ones he can't buy off." Langston studied Jonathan for a moment. "You've got guts, I'll give you that. But guts won't keep you alive." Back in the city, Jonathan and Daniel wasted no time securing the flash drive. They made multiple copies, storing them in encrypted locations. Jonathan had learned his lesson. If Callaway came after them, they needed insurance. "We can't just drop this on the internet," Daniel said. "We need credibility. We need someone with enough influence that Callaway won't dare touch them." Jonathan thought for a moment, then pulled out his phone. "Rebecca Owens," Daniel raised an eyebrow. "The journalist? She's the best investigative reporter out there. If anyone can get this story out, it's her." That night, they arranged a meeting. Rebecca agreed to meet them at a discreet location, a small cafe she used for off-the-record conversations. Jonathan and Daniel arrived early, scanning the area before sitting at a corner booth. Rebecca entered wearing a gray trench coat, her dark eyes sharp with curiosity. She slid into the booth, wasting no time. "You said you have something big. It better be worth my time." Jonathan placed the flash drive on the table. "This contains everything you need to bring down Richard Callaway." Rebecca eyed it skeptically. "I've heard that before." "Not like this," Daniel interjected. "This isn't just about Callaway's finances. This is about bribery, money laundering, and powerful figures protecting criminals." Rebecca picked up the drive, turning it between her fingers. "If this is real, you're both in serious danger." Jonathan nodded. "We know." Rebecca studied them for a long moment before slipping the drive into her pocket. I'll verify everything. If it checks out, I'll run the story. Jonathan exhaled in relief. Thank you, Rebecca smirked. Don't thank me yet. The next 48 hours were a blur of waiting and tension. Rebecca worked fast, verifying the files, cross-referencing data, and reaching out to trusted sources. Jonathan barely slept, his paranoia growing. He felt eyes on him everywhere he went. Then, the call came. Rebecca's voice was urgent. We have a problem. Jonathan's stomach clenched. What kind of problem? There's already movement on Calloway's side. I think they know someone's leaking information. One of my sources went dark, and I've received multiple threats. Jonathan's blood ran cold. Are you safe? For now, but we need to act fast. If we wait too long, Calloway will bury this. We'll meet soon. Stay alert. He hung up and turned to Daniel. It's happening. We need to go public now. Daniel clenched his jaw. Then let's make sure we do it right. They arranged for Rebecca to publish the initial findings as an exclusive expose. Within hours, the internet erupted with headlines. Breaking! Calloway Enterprises under investigation for fraud and corruption. Anonymous whistleblower exposes billion-dollar money laundering scheme. Corporate giant linked to political bribery and criminal enterprises. The news spread like wildfire. Social media exploded with outrage. Government agencies had no choice but to acknowledge the claims. And within a day, officials announced a formal investigation into Calloway Enterprises. Jonathan watched the chaos unfold from a safe house they had set up. Daniel paced the room, checking updates. Rebecca sent encrypted messages, confirming that journalists across the country were picking up the story. Then, Jonathan's phone rang. An unknown number. He hesitated before answering. Hello? A slow, familiar voice spoke. You've made a very foolish mistake, Harper. Jonathan's spine stiffened. Calloway? You think this is over? Calloway's voice was calm, but there was an undercurrent of menace. You think exposing me changes anything? Jonathan forced his voice to stay steady. The world knows what you've done. Calloway chuckled darkly. The world forgets. You, on the other hand, you won't get that luxury. The line went dead. Jonathan set the phone down, his pulse hammering. He knows, Daniel exhaled sharply. Then we need to disappear now. Rebecca sent a final message. FBI just issued a statement. Calloway is officially under investigation, but be careful, this is far from over. Jonathan nodded. He knew the fight was just beginning. The next morning, Jonathan woke to find an alert on his burner phone, a photo. A picture of his apartment door, taken from across the street. His blood ran cold. They had found him. We need to move, Daniel said, already gathering their things. Jonathan grabbed his bag. Calloway is desperate. He'll make his next move soon. Daniel nodded. Then let's be ready. As they disappeared into the crowded city streets, Jonathan knew one thing for certain. This wasn't just about taking down Calloway anymore. It was about survival. Jonathan Harper's mind raced as he and Daniel weaved through the crowded city streets, the burner phone still clutched in his hand. The picture of his apartment door was burned into his memory. They weren't just watching him. They were closing in. We can't stay in the city, Daniel muttered as they turned into a side alley, ducking out of view. Calloway has people everywhere. Jonathan nodded, his pulse pounding. I know. We need a new plan. Daniel checked his phone. Rebecca sent a message. The FBI is looking into Calloway, but it's slow moving. She thinks they might stall to protect their own. Jonathan exhaled sharply. Of course they will. Calloway isn't just another corrupt businessman. He's a lifeline for people in power. Daniel glanced around before speaking in a low voice. Then we stop playing defense. We go after him first. Jonathan met his gaze. How? Daniel smirked. We hit him where it hurts. They reached a small, rundown motel on the outskirts of the city. Rebecca was waiting in the lobby, tapping anxiously on her phone. When she saw them, she stood abruptly. You made it, she said, eyes scanning them for injuries. Barely, Jonathan muttered. They know where I live? Rebecca's expression darkened. Then it's worse than I thought. Calloway isn't just reacting, he's hunting. Jonathan sat down across from her. What's the status on the investigation? Rebecca sighed. The FBI is dragging their feet. They issued statements, but no real action has been taken. It's politics. No one wants to be the first to pull the trigger on Calloway. Daniel scoffed. So he still has protection? Rebecca nodded. For now. Jonathan ran a hand through his hair. Then we forced their hand. Rebecca narrowed her eyes. How? Jonathan leaned forward. If we leak something so explosive that the public demands action, the FBI won't have a choice. Calloway's allies will have to abandon him to save themselves. Rebecca considered it. You mean something bigger than the financial fraud? Jonathan nodded. Langston's files contain more than just money laundering. They show direct ties to organized crime. That's what we need to expose. Rebecca pulled out her laptop and opened the encrypted folder. All right, let's make this count. Hours later, the plan was in motion. Rebecca had pieced together a comprehensive report detailing Calloway's connections to crime syndicates, drug trafficking, and illegal arms deals. This wasn't just a case of white-collar crime, it was a conspiracy that reached deep into law enforcement and government agencies. They scheduled the leak for sunrise. Once this goes live, we won't be able to hide, Daniel said, double-checking their backup locations. Calloway will throw everything he has at us. Jonathan exhaled. Let him. This ends tomorrow. As dawn broke, the internet erupted. News agencies scrambled to verify the leaks. But the public wasn't waiting. Social media exploded with calls for Calloway's immediate arrest. Within hours, the FBI was forced to act. Jonathan, Daniel, and Rebecca watched from their safe house as the first televised raids were announced. Calloway's offices were being searched. Executives were being detained for questioning. The tide was turning. Then, Jonathan's phone rang, unknown number. He hesitated, then answered. Harper! A slow, deliberate voice came through. You think this is a victory? Jonathan's stomach clenched. Calloway? The man chuckled. You don't understand what you've done. Jonathan forced himself to stay calm. I exposed you? No, Calloway replied. You made yourself the most dangerous man in the room. And the most hunted. The line went dead. Jonathan set the phone down, his hands shaking. He's not finished. Daniel exhaled. Neither are we. Rebecca looked up from her screen. Then we prepare for the next fight. Jonathan nodded. They had won the battle, but the war was far from over. Over the next several hours, news coverage intensified. Protesters gathered outside Calloway Enterprises, demanding accountability. More evidence surfaced linking Calloway to offshore accounts, bribery, and even suspected murders. His once loyal investors were pulling out, his name being scrubbed from elite circles. And yet, Calloway himself remained elusive. He's hiding, Rebecca muttered as she scrolled through online reports. There's no sign of him anywhere. Jonathan nodded. That's because he's planning his counterattack. Daniel, who had been monitoring their security feeds, tensed. We might have a problem. Jonathan turned to him. What? Daniel pointed at the laptop screen. The motel's external cameras had picked up movement, several men in dark suits entering the building. They found us, Rebecca whispered. We move now. Daniel shut down their equipment while Rebecca wiped their data. Within seconds, they were out the back door, slipping into the alley just as their pursuers entered the motel. Jonathan's heart pounded as they disappeared into the city. The fight wasn't over. Not yet. They kept moving through side streets, avoiding security cameras and busy intersections. Every step felt heavier, knowing Calloway's men were closing in. Jonathan knew their only chance was to reach an ally before they were caught. There's an old safe house about 3 miles from here, Daniel said between breaths. Langston used it when he was in hiding. Rebecca frowned. Are you sure it's secure? Daniel hesitated, then nodded. It's our best shot. Jonathan didn't argue. They had no better options. The streets blurred as they pushed forward, adrenaline masking the exhaustion settling into their limbs. They ducked into a side entrance of a rundown building, Daniel using an old key to unlock the door. The room was sparse, a small table and chairs, a mattress in the corner, but it was safe. Rebecca pulled out her laptop. We need to figure out our next move, Jonathan exhaled. We need to find Calloway before he finds us. Daniel locked the door. Then we better move fast. The war was just beginning. Jonathan Harper sat at the worn-out table in the safe house, his fingers drumming against the wooden surface. The room smelled of old books and dust, remnants of its long-abandoned state. Daniel paced near the door, his gaze flicking between the boarded-up window and the flickering light bulb overhead. We need a plan, Rebecca said, breaking the silence. She was seated on the edge of the room, her laptop open, its dim glow casting a faint blue light on her face. Away. Won't just sit back and let this happen. He's coming for us. Jonathan exhaled, nodding. We can't keep running. If we stay on the defensive, we'll lose. Daniel stopped pacing. Then we take the fight to him. Rebecca glanced up. That's easier said than done. He still has money, power, and people protecting him. Jonathan leaned forward. What if we strip him of that protection? Rebecca frowned. You mean expose the people shielding him? Jonathan nodded. Exactly. If we make Calloway too toxic to protect, his allies will start jumping ship. Rebecca tapped a few keys. We'd need to identify his strongest connections, the ones who can't afford to be linked to this scandal. Daniel cracked his knuckles. Good. Who do we start with? Rebecca pulled up a list of names, Calloway's top political allies. Senators, corporate investors, law enforcement officials. If we can tie them to him in a way that forces them to act, they'll turn on him to save themselves. Jonathan studied the list. We leak the right information, create enough noise, and they'll have no choice. Rebecca hesitated. This could get messy fast. Jonathan's eyes darkened. It already is. The next 24 hours were a whirlwind of calculated leaks, anonymous tips, and carefully timed releases. Jonathan and Rebecca worked tirelessly, feeding information to journalists, social media influencers, and independent investigators. Within hours, new headlines began appearing. Top officials linked to Calloway's criminal network. Senator under scrutiny for ties to money laundering scheme. Major investors pull support from embattled CEO. The cracks were beginning to show. Rebecca pushed her chair back. Calloway's losing ground. His allies are abandoning him. Daniel, who had been monitoring their security feeds, tensed. We have a problem. Jonathan turned. What is it? Daniel pointed at the laptop screen. The motel's external cameras had picked up movement. Several men in dark suits entering the building. They found us, Rebecca whispered. Jonathan grabbed his bag. We move now. Daniel shut down their equipment while Rebecca wiped their data. Within seconds, they were out the back door, slipping into the alley just as their pursuers entered the motel. The streets were dark, the neon glow from flickering signs casting eerie shadows as they moved swiftly. Jonathan led the way, his mind racing. They needed a new hideout, but more importantly, they needed their next move. As they reached an abandoned warehouse near the city's outskirts, Jonathan turned to Rebecca. What's our next target? Rebecca checked her phone. We've weakened Calloway's foundation, but he's still standing. We need something bigger. Daniel pulled out his phone. Langston might have something. He's been quiet, but if anyone has dirt on Calloway, it's him. Jonathan nodded. Then we pay him a visit. Langston's hideout was a small cabin nestled in the woods far from prying eyes. When they arrived, they found him already waiting, his expression grim. You're causing a lot of trouble, Langston says. He let them inside. Jonathan smirked. That's the idea, Langston sighed. Calloway's getting desperate. He's making deals, calling in favors. He's trying to disappear. Daniel clenched his jaw. Then we make sure he doesn't. Langston motioned for them to sit. I have something for you. He handed Jonathan a folder, thick with documents. This is what you need to finish him. Jonathan flipped through the pages. Bank statements, offshore accounts, confidential emails, proof of everything. Rebecca's eyes widened. This is enough to bury him. Langston nodded. But you have to act fast. He's already trying to erase his tracks. Jonathan closed the folder. Then we don't wait. The final phase of their plan was set into motion. Rebecca compiled all the evidence into a single, damning expose. With Langston's help, they traced Calloway's last financial moves, discovering he was preparing to flee the country. He's booked a private flight out of a small airstrip in Miami, Langston said. He's running. Jonathan clenched his fists. Then we make sure he doesn't make it. Daniel nodded. We need to get the authorities involved. Rebecca hesitated. If we alert the wrong people, Calloway will be tipped off. Jonathan considered the risk, then made a decision. Then we don't go through official channels, we go public. As dawn broke, Jonathan and Rebecca uploaded the final wave of leaks. The documents spread like wildfire, hitting every major news outlet. Within hours, the FBI had no choice but to act. A breaking news alert flashed across the screen. Richard Calloway's escape plan foiled, manhunt. Jonathan watched as the media descended on Calloway's last known locations. The pressure was mounting, and for the first time, Calloway was running out of options. Then Jonathan's phone rang. Unknown number. He hesitated, then answered. Harper! A slow, deliberate voice came through. You think this is over? Jonathan's stomach clenched. Calloway? The man chuckled. You don't understand what you've done. Jonathan forced himself to stay calm. I exposed you. No, Calloway replied. You made yourself the most dangerous man in the room and the most hunted. The line went dead. Jonathan set the phone down, his hands shaking. He's not finished. Daniel exhaled. Neither are we. Rebecca looked up from her screen. Then we prepare for the next fight. Jonathan nodded. They had won the battle, but the war was far from over. Jonathan Harper sat in the dimly lit safe house, his eyes fixed on the news reports streaming across the television. The manhunt for Calloway had officially begun. His financial empire was in free fall, his allies scattering, and his face plastered on every major news network. But Jonathan knew better than to celebrate yet. He's desperate now, Daniel muttered, arms crossed. That makes him even more dangerous. Rebecca, hunched over her laptop, nodded. Calloway won't go down without trying. Take us with him. Jonathan exhaled. Then we have to be 2 steps ahead. We need to find him before he finds us. Daniel rubbed his temples. He was last spotted in Miami, but he won't stay put for long. Rebecca tapped her keyboard, pulling up financial records. I checked his offshore accounts. He's been draining them in chunks, transferring to untraceable wallets. He's preparing for something, Jonathan frowned. If he's pulling money, he's planning a move. We need to know where. Rebecca's fingers flew across the keys. Give me a few minutes. It didn't take long for Rebecca to find the answer. He made a large payment to a private charter service. One-way ticket. Destination, Argentina. Jonathan sat up. That's where he's running. Daniel clenched his jaw. We can't let him leave the country. If he does, we lose him. Rebecca grabbed her phone. We can tip off the authorities, but Calloway still has connections. If we go through normal channels, he'll be warned. Jonathan thought for a moment. Then we don't go through normal channels. With Rebecca's intel, they pinpointed the exact airstrip Calloway was planning to use. It was a small, unregulated strip outside Miami, perfect for an escape. Jonathan looked at Daniel. We go there, we stop him ourselves. Daniel grinned. Now we're talking. Rebecca hesitated. You realize what you're saying, right? This isn't just leaking files. You're going after him in person. Jonathan's gaze was steady. We've finished this. They moved quickly. Within hours, they were in Miami, driving toward the remote airstrip under the cover of night. The runway was dimly lit with a single private jet waiting. Security guards patrolled the perimeter, their silhouettes outlined by the faint glow of runway lights. Jonathan peered through binoculars. There, that's his jet. Daniel crouched beside him. We need a distraction. Rebecca, from the back seat of their rented car, was already typing away. Give me a second. Seconds later, the airstrip's alarm system blared. Red lights flashed, and the security guards immediately turned their attention to the commotion. Jonathan didn't hesitate. Now! He and Daniel sprinted toward the plane, keeping low. Calloway was already climbing the stairs to the jet, his face tense. Calloway! Jonathan shouted. Calloway turned, his expression morphing from shock to cold calculation. You just don't know when to quit, do you? Jonathan climbed onto the stairway, blocking his escape. It's over. You have nowhere left to run. Calloway smirked. You really think you've won? You have no idea what you're up against. Daniel appeared behind Jonathan. We know enough. Calloway's guards began to close in, but before they could act, flashing red and blue lights illuminated the runway. The FBI had arrived. Rebecca's voice crackled through Jonathan's earpiece. Told you I had a backup plan. Calloway's smirk faded as armed agents swarmed the runway. He glanced around, realizing he was truly trapped. Jonathan stepped closer. This ends now. For the first time, Calloway looked afraid. The arrest was swift and public. Calloway was handcuffed and led away by the authorities as cameras flashed. News networks broadcasted the footage live, sealing his fate in the court of public opinion before the trial even began. Jonathan stood by, watching as the man who had once seemed untouchable was taken into custody. It felt surreal. Rebecca joined him, arms crossed. You did it? Jonathan exhaled. We did it. Daniel grinned. And now? Jonathan glanced at the flashing lights, the reporters scrambling for statements. Now, we see what happens next. As they walked away from the chaos, Jonathan knew one thing. This chapter was over, but their fight for justice was far from finished. The next morning, Jonathan, Rebecca, and Daniel sat in a quiet diner, away from the public eye. The news played on a small television mounted on the wall, replaying Calloway's arrest on a loop. We should be celebrating, Rebecca said, sipping her coffee. But I can't shake the feeling that it's not over. Daniel nodded. Calloway may be in custody, but his network isn't gone. There are still people out there who benefited from his empire. They won't just let this slide. Jonathan agreed. We took down the kingpin, but the system that allowed him to thrive is still intact. Rebecca set down her cup. Then we keep going? We keep exposing corruption? This was never just about Calloway. It was about changing the way these people operate. Daniel smirked. Looks like we just found our next mission, Jonathan chuckled. We didn't just find it, we created it. As they stepped out of the diner into the crisp morning air, Jonathan felt the weight of their victory, but also the enormity of the road ahead. Their fight wasn't over. It was just beginning. The atmosphere in the diner was thick with tension as Jonathan Harper, Rebecca Owens, and Daniel sat in a secluded booth, watching the television screen mounted above the counter. The broadcast replayed Calloway's arrest, showing him being led away in handcuffs. The news anchors speculated about his upcoming trial, the mounting charges, and the ripple effects spreading through the business and political world. Jonathan took a slow sip of his coffee, his mind racing. This is just the beginning. Rebecca scrolled through her phone, her eyes sharp with concern. Calloway might be in custody, but his allies are already making moves. Some are laying low, while others are scrambling to protect themselves. Daniel leaned back in his seat. They won't go down without a fight. Jonathan nodded. Then we hit them before they can regroup. Later that evening, the team gathered at their safe house. Rebecca had compiled a detailed list of Calloway's closest associates, senators, corporate investors, law enforcement officials, and high-ranking executives who had profited from his empire. These people are smart, she said. They're moving their assets, distancing themselves from Calloway's downfall. If we don't act fast, they'll disappear. Jonathan studied the list. Who's the most vulnerable? Rebecca pulled up a name, Elliot Grayson. He was Calloway's chief financial officer, the one who handled all the dirty transactions. Daniel cracked his knuckles. Where is he now? Rebecca tapped a few keys. Last known location, New York City. Jonathan exhaled. Then we find him before he finds us. New York was buzzing with media coverage of Calloway's arrest, but Grayson had managed to stay out of the spotlight. With Rebecca's tracking, they traced him to a luxury penthouse in Manhattan. Jonathan adjusted his earpiece. Rebecca, do we have eyes inside? Rebecca's voice crackled through. I hacked into the building security feeds. Grayson is on the top floor with private security. Daniel smirked. That complicates things. Jonathan nodded. Let's move. They entered the building through a service entrance, using credentials Rebecca had acquired. The elevator ride to the top floor was silent, the tension palpable. When the doors slid open, they were met with 2 armed guards. Before they could react, Daniel moved, disarming one and knocking him unconscious. Jonathan took down the second with a swift punch. Rebecca's voice came through the earpiece. You've got 2 minutes before reinforcements arrive. Jonathan and Daniel moved quickly, reaching Grayson's suite. The door was locked, but Jonathan picked it within seconds. Inside, Grayson sat behind a massive desk, his face pale with fear. You don't understand what you're doing, he muttered. Jonathan stepped forward. We understand perfectly, Grayson smirked, though his confidence wavered. Calloway was just the beginning. You think his arrest changes anything? Jonathan leaned in. It changes everything. Rebecca's voice interrupted. Guys, you need to get out, now. Jonathan grabbed a flash drive from Grayson's desk and turned to leave, but Grayson wasn't finished. You'll regret this, he warned. Jonathan didn't look back. We'll see. As they exited the building, sirens wailed in the distance. They disappeared into the night, knowing their mission was far from over. Back at the safe house, Rebecca plugged in the flash drive. Let's see what we've got. Files upon files appeared on the screen, evidence of corruption, bribery, and worse. This was bigger than they'd imagined. Jonathan exhaled. We just found our next target. Daniel grinned. Then let's finish this. Rebecca nodded. This is only the beginning. Over the next 48 hours, they worked tirelessly, sorting through the files. Grayson had been meticulous in documenting Calloway's dealings, including records of secret meetings with politicians and law enforcement. Rebecca pushed her chair back. We have enough to take down half the people in Washington. Jonathan ran a hand through his hair. Then we exposed them? Daniel cracked his knuckles. How? Rebecca smirked. The same way we took down Calloway? Strategic leaks, targeted pressure, and public outrage? Jonathan nodded. Then let's get started. As they set their plan into motion, Jonathan knew one thing. This was no longer just about taking down Calloway's network. This was about changing the system. The following morning, news outlets exploded with new revelations, names, transactions, hidden deals, all laid bare for the world to see. The fallout was immediate. Politicians scrambled to deny involvement. CEOs issued statements distancing themselves from the corruption. Rebecca smirked. They're panicking. Jonathan nodded. Good, they should be. Daniel checked his phone. We've got another problem. Some of these people aren't just going to hide. They'll fight back. Jonathan sighed. Let them. We'll be ready. As the sun rose over the city, Jonathan realized they had crossed a line. This wasn't just about Calloway anymore. This was about something much bigger, and they weren't backing down.